Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this session on compassion in action, faith-based harm reduction initiatives as part of the 14th Annual International Conference on Stigma. My name is Ulysses Burley, and I serve as the chair of the United States HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition, which is hosting this session on harm reduction. We have a tremendous slate of panelists today, expertise in this work, and we look forward to sharing best practices and models and strategies around harm reduction with you all. Before we get into our conversation, I just wanted to share with you a bit about the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition. The U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition is composed of people of faith, faith leaders, people living with HIV, and people working in the HIV and AIDS response to develop and implement strategies to strengthen the role of faith communities towards ending the HIV epidemic. We are a coalition of more than 300 faith leaders nationwide. We are HIV positive. We are allies. We are same gender loving, trans and non-binary. We are Black, white, and brown. We are stigma warriors. But most of all, we are humans wonderfully made in the image of an inclusive creator. We believe that all people created in God's image are entitled to the promise of abundant life. This includes people with substance use disorder, people with mental health challenges, and people vulnerable to and living with HIV. As a community of believers, we first and foremost commit to do no harm. So it is a pleasure for the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition to host this conversation around harm reduction, and we look forward to the outcomes that will come from this great forum. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to today's moderator, Elder George Kerr, who is a longtime friend and founding member of the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition. George is committed to education, training, advocating, and collaborating for social justice through his faith and harm reduction. He has a long and determined history of effectively working with some of the DC's most prominent health service providers. He has motivated hundreds of individuals to advocate for those whom the stigma of HIV and substance use disorder has silenced. And he believes that together we can build a healthier community. It is my pleasure to invite our moderator, George Kerr, to guide us through the remainder of our discussion. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Dr. Burley. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. We're going to start off by doing introductions of our panelists. So first up is Elder Faison. Robert Faison is a passionate community change agent who currently serves as a program director at Empowerment Enterprise 2 Incorporated in Washington, D.C. As a member of the executive leadership team at the Community Church of Washington, D.C., UCC, and as Minister of Faith, Formation, and Mission of Emmaus United Church of Christ in Vienna, Virginia. Along with Empowerment Enterprise 2, Robert seeks to empower individuals and change community. Together, they create sustainable change by providing community enrichment through the programming that is focused on youth development, HIV/AIDS prevention, drug use awareness, harm reduction, life skill development, and community development. Up next is Elder Anderson Harvey. Camarian is a vibrant and visible trans-identified woman of color, passionate about inclusion and equity for all. She is Alabama State Director with the Human Rights Campaign, Kamarian became the first transgender person of color to serve in leadership role with HRC in the organization's history. Before joining HRC and relocating to Alabama, Kamarian worked in the public health and education field in Texas, managing local and national prevention initiatives, focusing on HIV AIDS and other health disparities that impact marginalized communities. Kamarian also serves as the National Minister for Trans Saint Ministry of Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. She has previously served as Associate Elder at the Living Faith Covenant Church in Dallas, Texas for 15 years before relocating to Alabama. Is a current member at First Congregational Christian Church, United Church of Christ, Birmingham, Alabama, and was reared in Dallas, Texas, with family roots in Natchez, Mississippi. Kamarian has one son and 3 adorable grandchildren. Up next, we have Reverend Paulette serves as the Minister of Harm Reduction and Overdose Prevention Ministry for the National United Church of Christ and is the founder and executive director of Faith and Harm Reduction. As a faith leader engaged in a long-term healing process from substance use disorder, Erica founded Faith and Harm Reduction to co-create a justice movement which connects people who use drugs and communities of faith through the development of harm reduction-centered spiritual resources, spiritual support, and spiritual care. So as we're getting ready to get started, we've asked Reverend Paulette to walk us through and kind of ground us in our conversation. So Reverend Paulette.
Thank you so much. And I'll just wait till we get to slide view and we've got a full screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, as we enter into this conversation today on compassion and action, I've been asked to ground us briefly in some harm reduction basics. So while there is no universal definition of harm reduction, there are some shared understandings. This definition is adapted from Harm Reduction International and elevates a few critical points. When we're talking about harm reduction, we are talking not only about an approach to building wellness, but also addressing the culture and the systems which negatively impact and marginalize people. I have changed HRI's definition to say human behavior rather than risky behavior, or specific and often stigmatized behaviors such as substance use, sex work, and sex, recognizing the impact of this labeling on what are largely universal human behaviors. And to this end, harm reduction is essentially grounded in justice and is a model for connection which walks alongside people without judgment, coercion, or discrimination. Next slide, please. When talking about harm reduction, I generally talk about it in 3 different ways. The first is risk reduction, which speaks to the programs and services we provide aimed at reducing the potential risks of some human behaviors. The second is lowercase HR harm reduction, and it is the principles and philosophy which root and guide our work. And lastly, capital HR harm reduction, which is a justice-rooted political and spiritual movement led by people most vulnerable to structural violence. Next slide. So in looking at each of these in a little more detail, we're going to begin with risk reduction or harm reduction in practice. So these are the tools and services to reduce the risks of potential harm resulting from a variety of behaviors. Things like HIV prevention strategies, such as providing sterile syringes or other safer injection supplies or condoms, access to trauma-informed mental health and other brain health care, overdose prevention strategies such as naloxone distribution, drug checking technologies, access to medications to prevent HIV transmission and or treat substance use disorder and reduce the risk of overdose, providing health care which recognizes the wholeness of people, And lastly, providing accurate, hysteria-free education and information about the risks and benefits of sex, drug use, and other human behaviors. Next slide. In thinking about lowercase HR harm reduction, the following principles are central to harm reduction, especially as we think about it in the context of faith communities. Harm reduction draws its roots from the ways of understanding the divine and the divine's relationship with humans and the world. In my Christian community, I draw from the ministry of Jesus Christ as expressed in the Gospels, in which I read about some of the first expressions of harm reduction ministry. Harm reduction in this way affirms the wisdom, dignity, and leadership of people with lived and living experience as the holders of the key to transformative change. Harm reduction understands that a key driver of harm is based in the stigmatization of behaviors and people, and centers the eradication of this stigma as a key goal. It draws from the deep wells of research and evidence and adheres to established and demonstrated best practices. Harm reduction recognizes that poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex and gender-based discrimination, and other inequities affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with potential harm. It is responsive to expressed community need, which means harm reduction is necessarily community-led. And lastly, harm reduction honors self-determination and human dignity. It empowers individuals to identify their own vision of wellness, pathways to healing, and supports any positive change, walking alongside people wherever they are. Next slide. Capital HR harm reduction recognizes that we come into harm reduction work and the harm reduction movement from different places, rooted in our own personal experiences, our love or grief for family members and friends, our professional experiences, our faith commitments, and our own exposure to injustice. Whatever the pathway, it moves us to look through the veils of stigma and criminalization, to see the full humanity and potential of all people, including ourselves, that society may have tried and continue to try to dehumanize. The harm reduction movement is committed to pursuing a model of public health as social justice. It asks us to hold ourselves accountable to combating the forms of racism, stigma, marginalization, and criminalization that place people in harm's way. It cultivates a deep understanding of the interlocking struggles against inequality and oppression as central to both health and liberation. It affirms the wisdom, dignity, and leadership of people most directly affected by these harms as the holders of the key to transformative change. As I listen into these principles, I hear echo of many of the tenets of my own faith and faith tradition, and the call of harm reduction as a movement for healing and justice. I hear empowerment through education. I hear humanity. I hear healing, life-giving, compassion, consent, dignity, love for neighbor, preferential option for those who have been marginalized, and justice with and for those whose humanity and rights have been denied. Next slide. In all of these, I see very clearly love and a gospel of harm reduction. Harm reduction in this way is also an invitation to faith communities. These are some of the invitations I hear us being offered and opportunities to grow as we seek ways to integrate harm reduction within our communities of faith. It is an invitation to advocate, to challenge the forces which seek to harm, not heal, especially when supported by unjust laws, us accountable to a higher law, to recommitting to connection and community building with people most impacted by stigma and structural violence, to proclaiming the dignity and divinity of all people that no human judgment can alter, to learning from and with people with lived and living experience, the ways of life-saving and life-giving, to co-create sacred space which allows all people to show up in our communities with their whole selves, to see the divine in one another, and to call one another by name. And that name I understand to be beloved. Thank you.
Thank you so much for grounding us in this conversation. So as our panelists come on, we decided to have an open conversation with you all today to talk about what was just laid out. So as our panelists come back on screen, so the first question, and we're going to start out, what are the challenges, opportunities to integrate harm reduction in community of faith in your particular content? So, Kamarian, Elder Anderson Harvey, would you like to start us?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My volume was going out just a little bit. Virtual bug. So can you repeat that for me, Elder George?
What are the challenges, opportunities to integrating harm reduction in community of faith in your particular content?
Yeah, so just a little background when I'm responding, although I'm with the illustrious United Church of Christ, my background is from the Pentecostal faith, Black church from the Deep South. And so with that being said, given that disclaimer, not to out or other denominations, but which is a harsh denomination that has a lot of rules, regulations, standards, and, you know, often in rituals, that's important to say. And I think that when we operate through a form of worship or discipleship or evangelism through the practice of rituals, we lose the opportunity of discipleship to connect with those, as I call, as the Bible say, Christian Bible, those other sheep that are not of this fold. Those sheep that are not of this fold, you know, as Reverend Erica mentioned around brain and mental health, of coping with some level of substance use, particularly as a Black woman of trans experience, or for my community, or those that are LGBTQ+, those that are coping with substance use because of discrimination, rejection. Being that I feel that the church, the edifice and the body is a place for all folks to come and be believers, we lose out, unfortunately, because of the strict standards and the mission of what we are promoting during worship. And so I have seen where it's very difficult to contextualize a scripture besides, you know, God loves you, and loves you while you're still going through whatever the challenge might be. And so trying to implement that. We also know that substance use is also connected to sexual transmitted infections level, meaning that when someone is using needle use, they're a high risk of contracting HIV and other elements because of the shared needle, because of the blood transfer. They will associate that when you talk about HIV equivalent to sex, and who is really talking about sex and Jesus. You understand? And so when those of us who are doing harm reduction work, it does become a challenge because we then have to recontextualize, and we have to also be an advocate to the scriptures of understanding that these are still souls, and we should have something implemented, whether that's a health ministry, an outreach ministry to all folks where the gospel is speaking to them in their current state. And we should not also, of course, be very judgmental. So there are challenges because the lack of education in faith spaces around harm reduction, how to engage with the harm reduction community, whether that's substance use, whether that's by priority population, orientation, gender. And then the other piece is that how do we actually welcome them in and contextualize such a welcoming gospel and promoting love through action and not just by words, is how I'll respond to that question. I'll yield my time for my other panelists to chime in.
Elder Faison.
Yeah, let me say good afternoon to everyone as well. I come representing the Community Church of Washington, D.C., United Church of Christ, and our nonprofit, Empowerment Enterprise 2 Incorporated. What I see as an additional challenge, and Elder Kamarian alluded to it, sometimes we get so focused on the scriptures, we get so focused on Bible, we get so focused on the worship experience that sometimes we don't feel comfortable going beyond the four walls of the church. Our focus and our emphasis is oftentimes on making sure that the worship service goes well, that everybody feels well in the worship service and sings and dances and preaches during the worship service. But we don't take sometimes churches don't place as much emphasis on doing the work beyond the four walls of the church, going beyond the Sunday morning worship experience. And so the community church and Empowerment Enterprise 2 and other churches that are in our circle, they've seen that we need to go beyond the four walls of the church to address the people who may never, ever cross the church doorstep, and to make sure that they are taken care of, to make sure that they know God's love, make sure that God accepts them where they are, and that humanity and God want to work with them to take them to wherever their new place is that they want to be. Not forcing anything on them, but providing them an opportunity to advance, to elevate as they see fit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I can quickly just add a kind of couple pieces on there. One of the, I think, kind of most powerful opportunities I've seen expressed in my own congregation here in New York City, as well as in my denomination nationally, has been a real opportunity for faith communities and their leadership to break the silence around so many of these stigmatized issues. I preached a sermon on the gospel of harm reduction out of my church here in Judson Memorial Church here in New York City, and heard from folks that they had never heard the substance use issue talked about from a pulpit, from within a community of faith, in a way in which they heard their names, their loved ones' names, included in the community of the beloved, and talked about with compassion, without judgment, in such a way that they felt that they were more able to, show up with the fullness of who they were and their whole stories and all of this. And I know too, thinking about the opportunity, and Dave, I see, posted a link to an incredible article about the overdose prevention centers here in New York City, which is one of the places I am based, and I provide some spiritual care, is also an opportunity to return people to community, right? I know Elder Faison just talked about this. This is where healing happens. It happens in the context of relationship. And, folks need to know that they are welcome just as they are. And yeah, thanks.
Let me just chime in. I think there's an added piece in this conversation. Always the first question we get warmed up. So I'm warmed up now. Okay, so let's get it. Let's get it together. But I think the other piece is that we don't want to leave without offering some opportunities where folks can actually get this level of professional and spiritual training. As Reverend Erica just alluded to, the work that the United Church of Christ and others are doing, who can actually partner with these congregations who want to learn and want to increase their knowledge on the holistic of humanity, reaching them in a way where they can be part of this fold of love and acceptance and inclusion. So I do want to point that out, that there are lots of curricula. There's a lot of experts and facilitators that can actually partner with these congregations. And remember, we are responsible, especially those that are leaders in congregations in their faith settings, that we are responsible for seeking out those professional development. I don't care how much academic you have and how much call and how much Holy Ghost. So, see, I told you I'm woke up now. How much Holy Ghost you might have. We are responsible, just like we are supposed to be good stewards of studying the scriptures, of studying the text of our faith. We also are responsible of seeking out extra academia training, because our congregation will need that. That is how you identify what's missing from the diversity structure of your congregation. And as well, it will increase how we go out and do evangelism and being a disciple in the earth of speaking the good news and living out and promoting the good news. And it's also ability to a way for us to be able to attach with them, because that will increase our level of empathy, to know that we once may not have been in their situation, but it took someone to empathize to even see us and welcome us into this faith space of being in community.
So one of the things that I've been able to do at my church, Westminster Presbyterian Church in Southwest DC, was we've been able to do 3 years of Recovery Sunday, where we have, during the Sunday service, people get up and talk about recovery and what that looks like for them, because every story is unique. And then the other one is International Overdose Awareness Day. And so I will point out that this past Monday, the mayor here in Washington, D.C. called for a state of emergency with our overdose crisis. Last year, we lost 462 souls. Let me say that again, 462 souls. And we've had 400 for the last 4 years. And then I was really pleased to hear Biden talk to the president of China about fentanyl and trying to do something about that. So I'm hoping that impact will work here in DC, as we are expected to lose another over 400 people this year.
And
So
George,
yes,
Elder George, just something I thought of, you just mentioned that it's important that we incorporate into our faith institution is the lived experiences, meaning that we have individuals that come up to our pulpits, for lack of a better word, whatever podium, however we're sharing the good news, and so that we hear from those individuals that are going through those lived experiences. Another challenge is that we go out, or we are in the church as quote unquote church folk, we think we know it all, we think we got it all together. So then we don't allow space, we don't allow room for the people who have the lived experiences to share from their perspective, provide insight, sometimes even provide expertise in the harm reduction that they seek. Many times we try to give people stuff that they don't necessarily want. Well, let's see what they want. Let's see what they need first, and then meet those needs rather than trying to force out what we think they need on them.
Well, I think that's an incredible point. And one of the points that really elevated for me and what I heard all of you say was, we're also not asking people to be reduction experts, right? We've got folks who are the experts, who are people with lived and living experience. And we've got harm reduction organizations around the country who are looking for partners, looking for allies, looking for ways to work in synergy across these issue areas. And so there's a number of opportunities. I know that we're going to share some resources towards the end about how you can be in contact with folks who are doing this work in your communities.
George, listen, George, this is couch conversation. We're all passionate about this. You're going to get to your questions, I promise you. But we are playing tennis left and right. What just dropped in my spirit, and because I'm in the Deep South and because I'm in the Bible Belt state, we use a lot of the church antics. That's what we somewhat live by. But we are understood, and this is from a Christian contextual, but I'm sure it's across other faiths. We are overcomers by our testimony, which means that it is important that those lived experience have an opportunity to share their testimony of how they experience to help someone else in the congregation or in the arena of religion and faith, because we are overcome by our testimony. We also become educated when we choose to share that love of testimony and voice. We then become the advocates in that environment for the harm reduction community. And it also helps humanize the conversation because we are testifying. And so I think it really is important. It's just like any agency, any job, any priority population, you must use those individuals who have the lived experience because it humanizes the challenges, the issues, but it also humanizes how we can celebrate being in one, even though it may not be my full experience. But again, I said earlier, we're able to empathize. So, the old church used to say, and this is for those who have a testimony, I believe that I'll testify why I have a chance, because I may not have that chance in the future. And that's a strong statement, is that some of us just needs to open up our mouths. Some of us are sitting in congregation that either work in the field of harm reduction, is familiar with it, and some of us can, I'm from Black church. We believe in tithes and offering. Some of us can withhold our tithes and offering to let the pastor know this is the way how we are showing up to show our protest, and until we start actually having, in my Christian background, the Bible, current events, and issues that is killing the saints. I'm already excited. That is killing us that are the beloved, rather than promoting life more abundantly. And part of that is to have these type of courageous conversations in our congregation because it's life-saving.
I couldn't agree with that anymore. So I'm just going to say amen, ashe. And so this is a real conversation we're having here. We have some questions here that eventually we might get to, but no, I just want to continue as we are. And one of the things that I talked about the Recovery Sunday, and it's been very powerful to have people come up to me after church and say, I've been going through this, or I know someone. we do not know who's in the congregation that is having to deal with substance use issues, suicidal, mental health, all these things. So if we're not speaking from the pulpit about it, then we've got to find another way to get there. I've had ministers tell me, I will not allow anyone else to share my pulpit except for another pastor. And I can't work with that congregation because I need to know that you value lived experience. So
I say quite often, so I have the pleasure of working with a number of the different the National Drug Users Union, as well as a couple of the regional drug users unions. And, to watch and be witness and be allowed to participate in ministry alongside community leaders, harm reduction leaders, people who use drugs. I have never met more powerful ministers in my entire life. And my goodness, what an honor it is to be able to kind of take my lead in understanding what ministry looks like in this context from people who are living it, right? And yeah.
I'll go ahead and ask this question that came in. Kamarian, there are still souls. Yes, we should have something implemented for all. How can we welcome them in?
Oh, the question. Thank you for that's another. That really is an easy question. Love and kindness have I drawn thee.
And part of that love, as I stated earlier, is empathy. What is our strategy for outreach, for discipleship? When they do come in, when we say that they're welcome, are we putting forth that welcome through action? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel othered? Do they feel that they have to sit in the back of the congregation in order to just exercise, their belief of practicing something spiritual in community? So for me, I feel that it starts from the head and work down, but it also is yin yang. It can start from the bottom up. There needs to be opportunities for diversity of worship in congregation. I'm not talking about the rituals, but what are we saying across that pulpit? What are we saying, when we have the mic? What are we saying when we say we're going to go out and go share the good news of whatever you subscribe to, love, salvation, community? What are those? What are those talking points, rather? And then being able to bring folks in, regardless of the fact you don't want to share your pulpit, put an easel down on the floor and bring those experts, bring those who have those lived experience, set up, certain days. I use an example when I came over to affirming ministry 20-something years ago. I felt that when we was adopting what we came out of, to say that it was still appropriate. For instance, Women's Day. In Black church in the South, we have Women's Day. We're going to be white head to toe. Okay. That's including what you can't see is going to be white. Okay. That was just part of our culture. But to be honest, even when they had Men's Day, where they wanted to wear the bow ties or hats or whatever the theme was for them, how many times are we losing out of the diversity in all of us? And so we switched that to Femininity Day and Masculinity Day, because there are some individuals that actually want to be able to be honored in both. Well, how come we can't have a harm reduction day? It's just as simple as that. Doing things outside of the box, doing non-conventional things can be a benefit for congregation. So it will then reduce the mundane of the structure that we're coming in. Here's a program. We're going to open up the doors of the church. It is just formality. How do we get out of the formality state and actually reach those, in my opinion, that needs the gospel, needs the love, and to promote that God loves you. We love you in the state that you're in. You are welcome here at the table. You have a seat, a gold nameplate, that whenever you choose to come and get the refuge you need, that it is available. But we also have to get our congregation conditioned, because it's nothing like bringing someone in and it's the congregation who has the lack of knowledge, and then that becomes very through their action, a distance or othering those. We want to make it a true, welcoming, brave space environment for anyone, especially our harm reduction community. Because believe it or not, in the Deep South, going to church or practicing our faith is a cultural thing. And when we are kicked out, then what happens is the notion that we are now, we can't serve the God that we heard that is of love. That we, as those who are the voice piece of the gospel, are we truly promoting that we're serving an angry God that can accept you because you're part of the harm reduction community? And I don't think that's so. So to answer that question is that there is just going to have to be some work that's going to have to be done, some education, and the environment's going to have to be set, because when one come, I believe they'll all come if that atmosphere and environment is set for them to be in their truth and to worship.
And I'm going to come sit beside Elder Harvey on the couch. Watch your mouth. Watch your mouth. A lot of people will be turned away because of what we say. We use terms that are not accepting. We use terms that are not inclusive. Saying that someone is that person's an addict, when now you have now classified that person as being an addict, when your terminology should be something that's entirely different. So they use the old phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but never hurt me. That is a lie. Some people have been traumatized by the words that they have heard from other people more than any stick or any stone could have ever traumatized them. So, and I know with EE2 and with the community church, we are very mindful of the language, and we even teach others. This is what the appropriate language, these are the appropriate terms that you need to use as we're interacting, again, to Elder Harvey's point of educating the congregation so that they know how to address issues and how to address so that we can create that welcoming environment. So watching your mouth from the pulpit to the door, and in all those little committee meetings that you may have, and all those parking lot conversations that you're a part of, watch your mouth.
Yes, no, exactly. And that communication piece is so important. It's both what we say as well as what we don't say, right? And so going back to that kind of notion of silence and really the powerful message that folks hear when they don't hear themselves in the stories of hope that we are telling. And I also want to say, on a very practical level as well, we had to, as a congregation, really do some challenging of the ways that we had institutionalized a culture which stigmatized people who use drugs and, subtly or not so subtly kind of made distinctions about who we thought we were versus who they were, right? And so to Elder Comarian's, I think used the word othering, we have been making safer injection kits in partnership with the Lower East Side Harm Reduction Center for decades and decades. We never once kept a single one of those kits at the congregation. We exported those straight out. And, what does that say about who we imagine kind of is within our space and within our communities? And for folks who are there, my goodness, how wounding. And so starting to look too about, many churches offer up space. Space is a really hot commodity here in New York City and a lot of other cities. And so we make space available for 12-step fellowships and all of these. And I believe that they have a really incredible place. And are there ways that we're communicating that people who are not interested in 12-step fellowship and are still struggling or kind of trying to navigate relationships with drug use are also welcome? Do we have signs up that talk about people who use drugs are beloved by God? Do we have kind of referrals or places or resources to point folks towards where they can access whatever resources they need to kind of pursue wellness for their own selves?
This year, for the first time, I was invited to speak at a recovery program. And it wasn't too long ago. I would say maybe 3-4 years ago, that would have been unheard of. But we are now connecting recovery and harm reduction. And I think it's such a beautiful thing that we needed to have done it. And so for that to happen now. So, Elder Faison, what are some strategies that your nonprofit and faith institution have used to engage teenagers in harm reduction work?
Yeah, so one thing we need to remember is that I know we grown, and many of us on this call are real grown, but we also recognize that our teenagers need to become aware of the significance and the importance of harm reduction as well. Fortunately for the community church and Empowerment Enterprise too, we have a lot of young people. I think probably the oldest, quote unquote, I think we only have one person in the church that's probably over 70 years old. Everyone else is within their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So even that is a little older when you compare those to teenagers. But we have a unique a niche on connecting with young people. So we have provided opportunities where we provide education to young people, to teenagers. We do a lot of work during the summertime when the students are out of school. And we also provide opportunities for the teenagers to go out and do canvassing work as well. Now, of course, they're going with adults just for safety reasons. But again, we allow them not only to be educated on what harm reduction means, but to go out and see it in action. For us, we do a lot of work in Ward 7 and Ward 8 in the Washington, D.C. area, two of the more challenging wards as it relates to the needs for harm reduction. So we do that. We even set up situations where they have actually created videos themselves that focus on harm reduction. We had a special project we did, I believe it was last summer, where we encouraged the youth to create a video that talks about harm reduction and music. How does harm reduction, how does rap music, how does trap music, how do all the different types of music, how do they support and encourage harm reduction? Or how do they perhaps create hindrances to harm reduction, some of the lyrics that are in those? And so and the youth were very proud because they want to be involved in doing something. So if we have something where they can get their hands dirty and get their hands involved in doing, they're very excited about that. We encourage them to create some social media postings as well. So they had a social media campaign that they did where they were highlighting some of the stars, like August Alsina, Samuel L. Jackson, Michael Jackson, and how they were impacted, regarding harm reduction and drug use and drug overdose and things like that as well. So we need to make sure we are connecting our youth into the teenagers, youth, and young adults into the harm reduction work that we're doing. Not only giving them the information, but allowing them to apply the information, allowing them to learn from the community that may have a need for harm reduction measures.
If I may just add something around the youth, for someone who actually, work in policy and legislation where our youth have been under attack, I want to just add is that parents, guardians, this is an opportunity. I'm from the Deep South, and the meeting ground was the church. That's where we got the real-time education, that we got the motivations that we needed, where schools are not in position because of certain legislation to have these conversations. This is where the church and the faith spaces actually can come in at. And then for those that are youth leaders, someone put in the chat, which is very important, people's first language is important. So we will have to get on their level to have these intentional conversations. Harm reduction is impacting our teenagers, our youth. I mean, just as early as, 5th grade on up. One is used as a coping mechanism. Number 2 is used as recreational. And number 3, just to be in the in crowd and not be just because of the things that you don't do. But the church has an opportunity for our next generation to speak their people's first language, get them engaged. It's not taking anything away from, I'm old school, from the children's church Sunday school. You can incorporate some of these guidance that they need that's going to protect them. And we will need those parents and guardians support because, we can help. Many of us are not eating at the dinner table every day. We're not eating as a family to have those conversations. So we have to find institutions that's part of our culture to also share the load of conversations, especially to help reduce the stigma that's around. And that's the biggest. It's a stigma. Then nobody really wants to talk about it. It's very uncomfortable to really talk about it. But I guess what we are also wanting to promote is that we know that it's a stigma, and the best way to help reduce the stigma is to have that conversation. It's going to lead to education and lead folks an opportunity to ask questions, ask for resources, and do we actually have those programs set up when they say it is me and I need help? Erica?
Yeah, no, that was I was thinking about, and you talked about youth leadership and thinking about, how the context, that folks are using substances is very different than the context within which I was using. The drug supply is very different. The political and legislative landscape is very different. And depending on where you are in the country, it's much more dangerous. And depending on what the color of your skin is, it's much, all of these things, we know these things. And so really equipping young people to be able, we know that they are the trusted messengers. They are, they are more than capable of leading kind of these conversations and efforts. And it's, I think, it's really on us to follow their lead and to listen into the language, right, that's using, and listen into the experience that young people are having. And when I think actually about the kind of communities that I do a lot of overdose prevention training, specifically with communities of faith where I live in the Bronx, New York. And the majority of folks who are coming up and asking for access to naloxone are young people who are living with people who use drugs and who say that I have used this to save my mother. I can't tell you how many times. And are ones who we also know that people who use drugs are more likely to save the lives of other people who use drugs, right? Because they are the ones who are there. They are the ones who are in relationship and in community with one another. And so, my goodness, what an incredible gift to be able to empower young people, children, to be able to care for themselves and care for others and care for their families.
So I want to remind everyone to please utilize the Q&A below and ask your questions. We will be taking those. But I want to steer us away to a different area. What differences have you experienced in introducing or emphasizing harm reduction in predominantly white congregation or organizations versus predominantly Black and Brown congregations or organizations?
So I'll start on this one. I know a lot of the work that we've done has been within the Black congregations or the Black and Brown context. And some of the challenges, one, there's been a lot of disparity that's been experienced among the Black and Brown populations. There's been a lot of, there's a lack of trust to a certain degree because sometimes the Black and Brown community have been the specimens, they've been the quote unquote guinea pigs for stuff. And so there's a degree of resistance or a degree of concern in those situations. There's also, at least in our experiences with the community church and the Power Enterprise too, they want us to come in and meet them where they are. They don't want us to come in with some great grandiose presentation, some great grandiose words. They want us to be able to, they can meet us where they are because they can feel a connection that way as well. And unfortunately, sometimes they want to see someone that looks like them, someone that has a shared experience to them, and they're more receptive in those situations. When we have come in with the grandiose presentations, or when we've done all this and that, they're like, oh, they're trying to act like somebody that they're not, or they're trying to be someone. Elder's probably smiling because I know she's probably the word that we often hear when we go in as articulate Black and Brown people. We're trying to act like somebody else. And so we learned very early on to go in just as we are. And then as we are able to meet them where they are as Black and Brown people, we can take them to that next level. So we even had to realize, because we were taking out a lot of extra stuff when we were doing our canvas and outreach. They really didn't need all that. They just need, okay, hey, some food substance, some sort of beverage. We carried out Narcan. We always included that, to Reverend Erica's point about they needed it themselves to share with family members. But a lot of literature, they didn't want all that literature because most times they're going to turn around, they're going to throw it in the trash. But if you give them a handout that's crisp, concise, that has everything they need, a one-pager, for our experiences with the Black and Brown community, that's what that's been and we've been very successful once we learned what would be most conducive for the Black and Brown community.
Eric, did you want to say something before I jump? Because
Jump right in, I'll follow.
You know, this question has to be unpacked when we speak about, white congregations versus Black and brown. And maybe, just from what I experienced living in a Bible Belt, but we have to talk about the acceptance of someone who's before them. So we'll use a white congregation as an example. There's more privilege. There's more resources. In the Black and brown churches, oftentimes there is lack of privilege, lack of access, and lack of resources. There's also a cultural divide. In the Black and brown church, are we really talking about substance use? Are we really talking about harm reduction? And yes, we are dying from it as well because we're not speaking about it because it has not been ingrained into our culture, because oftentimes we don't have the resources. If that is an impact, we don't have the resources to send them to a treatment center. Even the embarrassment of being Black and brown in our culture when it goes against the grain, that's an embarrassment. And so oftentimes it's like, don't speak of it, or, in the context of coming to worship, don't show up what you're going through. Just show up. It's almost like I call it the hypocrite worship. If they don't ask you, you don't have to tell them. I do feel that white congregation, even when I'm saying privilege and access, they have a little bit more liberation as it relates to having these conversations, because it's also attached to the resources and the financials and the networks that they, and the access that they have, that if that does show up in that level of congregation. So when we are going in, for myself, when I'm going in to speak about harm reduction, when it's a Black church, and Elder Robert said it earlier, my conversation is so totally different. I'm speaking King James, and I'm speaking street, and I'm speaking what our cultural language. When I go into the white congregation, to be honest with you, what they really sometimes see is just this Black female, bless her heart, who is talking about something that particularly impacts with our community. Because it's like, because I'm not the color of their skin, and because I'm not speaking their people's first language, perhaps they don't think that it's just an issue. And so it's just a clap of a great presentation. I hope I painted that okay. So it becomes a cultural thing. And so when we're looking at curriculum, and those that are producing curricula, whether that's SAMHSA, whether it's nonprofits, when we're doing it has to also center from a cultural standpoint. So no matter who is there assisting congregation or that environment around harm reduction, that it meets the audience where they're at, and they no longer see it versus a privilege, access, non-privileged, non-access, but they see it that it is an issue and that humanity is dying from the issue. And how do we come together as advocates to secure folks from dying from harm reduction? And so that is how I want to respond to the question, because it's a loaded question anytime, unfortunately, you bring race in and the geographic of how our culture and how we live that out.
No, and I think it's a really powerful question. I mean, I think about it in the context of where I work most often, which is here in New York City and in the Bronx, which is where I'm based, and thinking about the opportunity to have conversations with a variety of communities of faith. And while the conversation quite often has a very similar aim, we're starting from different spots and from different considerations. And so I'm thinking about my colleague, Reverend Seeley, who's in the South Bronx, and talking about, to Comarian's point around, resources. She says, when my, white colleagues and white congregations in Manhattan are talking about overdose and are talking about wanting to connect people to communities and systems of care, those are there. They are accessible. When we're talking about kind of a response, whether that be an official government response, policy response, whatever it be, the way that they're responding to my community, which is in the South Bronx, is they're responding with putting police towers up in our neighborhoods. They are responding with, wanting to build our 5th or 6th or whatever prison it is. And they're not talking about expanding access to, overdose prevention centers or 24-hour communities of care, or resourcing congregations like Reverend Seeley's to be able to kind of foster these conversations and hold these resources within the community, right? And so I think that piece is, I think that piece is really critical, and really understanding, for myself as a white faith leader in a largely white denomination, looking at, and who runs the harm reduction ministry, is really, understanding that we're, talking about the war on people who use drugs, right? Which is, in my context, I focus largely on substance use, comes out of a deep legacy of racism. I mean, that's the way that these policies and laws and all these things came to be. They do not, and very rarely, target somebody who looks like myself. And so really holding that as part of my commitment to, anti-racist practice as part of harm reduction, and really being a critical.
And being and let me say this, and just being an ally and an activist, we must call out harm reduction, even from a race where substance use was planted in certain races and demographics, just to set us up, to not have that equal access or power that's needed. And so some of us need to go back to the history, of harm reduction, and when we bring that into contextualize from a faith space, sometimes we're still promoting the very thing that was planted, in us, versus us, really calling that out, but also promoting a level of healing and acceptance for those harm reduction individuals. And I really love that example. Much as I visit New York, I understand the Manhattan versus the Bronx. I understand that when I was living in Texas and now living in Alabama, what that dynamics look like. You have more policing, we'll say it like that, then you do, institutions of treatment and wholeness. And so those are the things that will make a contextualized sermon. You understand where I'm going? That's how you can introduce to empower the congregation, because at me being Black, I know what it feels like to live in a racial world. So let us talk about it. It's equivalent to harm reduction as well. There is not a lot of resources for us that are Black and brown. Let us talk about that. And then how do we mobilize? How do we take that sermon of all the amens and the shake, and in my background, the speaking in tongues, all the transfer that strategically into a plan of action, and go ask what we are doing for in our communities, to make sure that on the other side of the railroad track, we can duplicate that same care and treatment on our side of the railroad track, because we too are dying. Listen, this is so passionate for all of us, but it is very elementary. Is that we have to start and have the conversation. We have to gain the knowledge, and we have to implement this holistically in our faith spaces, because it is attached to us. And one thing that is that we don't speak about, that's not attached to us, can actually be harm to us. And I don't think that that's what our role, responsibility, and our call and charge is supposed to be.
And 2 sentences I'll add: this is a social justice issue as well. Harm reduction and social justice are very closely tied to one another. So if our faith institutions are not talking about social justice, then it's going to make it even harder to talk about harm reduction, because they're very closely tied to one another.
So I would just add that we've got to make sure the church is outside the 4 walls, that it's out into the community, because that's where we are needed most. And so I'm going to switch focuses for a minute, and we're going to go to some questions in the chat, question and answer. So Elder Faison, can you expand the challenging environment east of the river in DC, particularly for those not familiar with the area?
So for those areas, which primarily Ward 7, Ward 8, there is a lot of economic challenge in those areas. There is limited employment opportunities in those areas. And because of the limited employment, limited income to households, there's a lot of disparity in health opportunities, healthcare opportunities within those wards as well, as opposed to some of the other wards within the District of Columbia, where there is a plethora of healthcare opportunities, a plethora of employment opportunities. And when I say employment opportunities, gainful employment opportunities. And so that is some of the disparity that exists. And of course, when there's disparity, then you deal with issues of self-esteem. Then you deal with issues of individuals that may not want to go to school because they feel there's no hope in going to school. Then you have those issues of people that may not be seeking any sort of career endeavors because they don't feel they can make it because they don't go to school and they have all the disparity. So it's like a domino effect. Everything just kind of piles on top of everything and piles on top of everything. So they feel that the best thing that they could probably do, well, let me just go, hang out on the street with my friends. Well, we also know that sometimes a lot of gatherings can, a lot of unproductive activities could occur in those gatherings as well. So you deal with those situations as well, the hopelessness, the despair, the disparity. So all of those things factor in, and those are most common within Ward 7 or Ward 8 or east of the river for us here in the District of Columbia area. And George, I know you're here in the District of Columbia as well, so I definitely encourage you to add to that conversation as well, to that question.
I would just echo everything you just said, and that we need to continue to do more. And to bring a spotlight to these inequities. So this is an interesting question. Can you speak about the history of spiritual leaders in harm reduction? You all are amazing, but I'd love to know if there's a history of these works coming up through the AIDS epidemic.
Yes, my goodness. Our colleague, Reverend Edwin Sanders, who is not on today, has been leading these efforts for decades out of his congregation in Nashville, Tennessee, and beyond. Ed was part of an original group of clergy who I believe were originally entitled Clergy for a Just and Compassionate Drug Policy, and was based here in New York City with Reverend Howard Moody and Ed Sanders and a bunch of others who really helped kind of catalyze that conversation, like I said, decades ago. We started a harm reduction sermon series, about 2 years ago at this point, really with the hopes of being able to capture the voices of people who have been leading this work and have really created the legacy of faith-based harm reduction work. And so Ed Sanders was one of our first. Our second was Father Luis Barrios, who is originally was here in the Bronx and is now in Puerto Rico, and he is largely responsible for the legalization or kind of sanctioning of syringe service programs here in New York City. He was an Episcopal priest. He is an Episcopal priest who was working out of St. Mary's congregation in the Bronx. He was told that, my goodness, what you are doing is not only illegal, but against the policies and kind of the call of the church. So we're going to put you on desk duty and we're going to take your parish away from you. And he said, you know what? Fine, do it. It just means I'm going to have more time to do this holy work of harm reduction. And he really helped in partnership with some of the early harm reduction organizers and ACT UP organizers to ensure that our communities had access to the resources and supplies they needed to be well and healthy and loved. So
as Elder Faison stated, I started as an HIV activist with Larry Bryant, who's on here, and founded DC Fights Back, where we were really working in the early 2008 on HIV here in the District of Columbia. And that's where I really started understanding the linkage between harm reduction and HIV. And it's still relevant today that we need to continue having these conversations, because neither one of them are being talked enough right now. We need to do more. We need to have conversations from the pulpit, talking about HIV, talking about harm reduction, and, watching Capitol Hill. I'm going to turn to political for a moment. With all the cuts they are trying to do to HIV, it's really scary for individuals like myself that are living with HIV. And so we need to make sure that our voices are held on Capitol Hill as well.
George, I want to just lift up two other individuals that may be very known, because they've done a great way of intersecting HIV work, harm reduction work, housing, those social determinants of health. I can't leave out my own prelate Bishop Yvette Plunder, where in the West Coast, when she was doing this work very early with Bishop Carl Beans, led into a foundation where majority of her service, even when you walk into her mega church, as I like to say, they actually have a clinic there in order to service those with these levels of disparities. And part of that is the harm reduction. I want to run over to the South, over in the Carolinas, Bishop Tanya Rawls, who created the Freedom Center for Justice, that have a lens of harm reduction and reduction of HIV and stigma and gender identities. So I want to lift those two individuals up because I know they're very much well known, but we often see them on the trail of just preaching wholeness, to the LGBTQ plus community and recruiting more allies, but they are also intentional about the intersectional of our living when it comes to harm reduction. So I do want to lift those two individuals up because their work is very much impeccable and it is touching those from a Black culture and Black church experience. And we need more, like them. I'm from the Dallas area originally. And so, I went to a training and I'll lift this other person, Pastor Freddie Haynes, who, is one of the original of the Proctor Conference. We can learn from these mega pastors, these wonderful influence pastors, of how they're doing the work and how they're mixing that also with the gospel. And to be honest with you, it is just ethically our responsibility. And so what happens if you do have someone that says that I fall within the arena of harm reduction? They won't say it like that. They're going to tell you exactly, are we in position and are we, capable of servicing those individuals without saying, well, let us pray. Well, I think prayer does change things. But at that moment, sometimes, we have to also get the scripture that we must, be patient, wait and see. So what do they need right now? And what they need is that if they walk into our congregation from a Christian standpoint, if that is deemed to be the Saints Hospital and you don't have anything from them, then what service have we actually provided this particular soul? And will they be able to find beloved community because they walked through your doors and they were seeking some type of assistance that turns into sanctuary?
So one other person that we really need to lift up, and that's Dr. Rana, who is online here. And thank you for your many years of the Stigma Conference and bringing awareness here in DC. He writes, I am a Muslim and a student of Quran. There are approximately 100 commandments. God is one and has no partner, being one. 99 are about social justice. So the question is, why religion? The why of religion in God. What's social justice? So he directed that to you, Elder Faison.
So could you repeat the question portion of it again? Just to make sure I have clear understanding.
Is why religion? The why of religion is God wants social justice.
The why of religion. Forgive me, I'm not following the question. And maybe one of the other panelists, you're welcome to help me if you have a better understanding than I do.
Why we should be doing social justice from the pulpit.
Got you. Okay, now I got that. Because, well, my Christian faith tells me that because Jesus was about social justice. Jesus was about equality. Jesus was not about not allowing oppression to continue. He was about making sure that everyone was taken care of, cared for, that needs were supplied, even to those that were marginalized, even to those that were rejected by the religious leaders within the church as well. So that's why social justice is so necessary, because my understanding of Christianity is that at the crux of Christianity is equality of all people, humanity of all people, respect, love, peace for all of creation. That can be achieved through the lens of social justice, making sure that there is opportunity for all of creation to experience all that life has to offer. There's one scripture within the Christian faith that Jesus came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Well, I believe that abundant life includes equality, includes health care for all people, includes fair wages for all people, includes all of that. That's a part, I believe, of the life abundantly, which social justice promotes a lot of that equality for all people. And I definitely encourage other
Yeah,
members to add to that.
let me, something just came to mind if I may add, because some of us, when we're contextualized scripture, I want you to realize that you're there's a word that just slipped my mind. You are expounding on social justice even when you're not even aware, but we want you to be able to be aware to act on social justice. You know, when I think of social justice from my Christian faith, is that I like to link social and liberation justice. I think they go hand in hand, but I just remember, if I can just, give a cute little quick homily, is that social justice is just as equivalent to the great teacher when, they brought the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. Jesus, what are you going to do about this? And Jesus looked on the ground and start coloring. I'll just say it like that, and then raised up and say that you who are without sin, you cast the first stone. That is justice. That is saying that, if you don't know about harm reduction, don't sit here and other them, tap into your empathy and find out, what you experience, and then tell me if you can judge this individual. How about when Jesus was on the cross, dying for all of our sins of the world, and then turns around and say, Lord or God, forgive them, for they know not. Forgiveness is also part of social justice, even in harm reduction. Forgive yourself for not knowing, forgive those, with the lack of education, and forgive that you have not done your part in welcoming everyone into this beloved community, and go get the education you need. And the final piece that hit home for me, that most people will call now the current day of our transgender community, but the eunuch who was not really technically, was supposed to be baptized, but social justice and liberation allowed Philip to drop right in and baptize that eunuch, because the eunuch was aware that how come I can't be included? I'm only bringing those three examples up because when we mix social and liberation justice together, we find that we are all in this together, and we should not exempt anyone from having the opportunity, as Reverend Erica loves to say, in this beloved community where we can grow together. The Bible tells us to forsake to assemble ourselves among believers, because that's where we give energy. When they come in, they're looking for something, and they're not looking for you to judge them. They're not looking for you to out them when they already know that they may be having a challenge. What they're looking for cannot be loved enough until I can get over what I'm trying to work on, and will you accept me? And our role responsibility is that you are welcome here at the table. You're welcome here in this place of worship. You're welcome in this beloved community, and tell us what you need, and we will sit here and support you.
So we're getting close to the end. So we have one more question. How influential is funding impacting the messaging coming from the pulpit? And to what degree are politics and popular culture influencing our message from the church? That sounds like that's a question in a webinar all by itself. But Reverend Paulette?
Oh, goodness gracious. Yes. No, I was just going to say we need a whole nother kind of day-long webinar on this one in particular. I mean, in many ways, I've looked at, I think somebody referenced the kind of current administration, and while was being referenced in the context of funding cuts, also was the first presidential administration to include harm reduction as part of its national drug control policies, as well as have explicit dedicated funding for harm reduction. While we may have ideas and feelings about the way that actually rolled out, nonetheless, it was the first ever dedicated harm reduction funding that came out a couple of years ago as part of the American Recovery Act. And secondarily, also really understanding the need to kind of move folks in power along with. And I think faith leaders are particularly well positioned to be conversation partners in that. We recognized at the United Church of Christ, which has had an overdose and drug use ministry for some time, that it was really essential to Elder Roberts' point around, we understand harm reduction to be essentially and fundamentally a justice-rooted issue, a racial justice issue, a social justice issue, gender justice, all of this, and that resources in our denomination are tied to official resolutions, and that's how resources get kind of allocated to what the work of the church is, or to what ministries. And so we worked for the last couple of years to finally get a harm reduction resolution passed at our last synod, with the hopes that then this really helps to mobilize and leverage existing attention. It's harm reduction is pretty prevalent in the kind of political imagination these days, and both for good and for bad. But anyways, I think that kind of ongoing conversation and leaning into these opportunities for these tough conversations or brave conversations, to Elder Comarian's part.
Elder Robert, let me go before you. Robert, let me go before you, because you just, yeah. Oh, that's George. I'm gonna go before you, Robert. Only thing I want to just add is that we missed the opportunity as a congregation, as a faith environment, to collaborate. Okay. And so sometimes the collaboration can bring the resources that you need. Okay. I know that we talk about different denominations and Reformation. I'm Deep South. Some of us don't even have that level of attachment. We are keeping the church above float because we're bivocational. Okay. But sometimes partnering with those public health entities, whether that's nonprofit or the health department, there's many grants that are out there that is deemed for the church, and they will partner with you to help you write it and help you work that through. But sometimes it's just a matter of, as we said earlier, to leave out of those four walls and actually go do the work. Part of discipleship is not just going to tell individuals about the good news, but also seek the resources that are needed to attach to the good news. It almost reminds me of feeding of the 5,000 in the New Testament. Is that they needed resources, they needed food. Although they were being healed, that they enjoyed the word from the great teacher, at the same time they were famished. And so discipleship means that we have to go seek those resources. We have to collaborate. And this is no longer this is where the divide comes in. It's no longer about denominationalism. It's no longer about what faith you belong to. This is about humanity. This is about life saving. This is about, you have resources. How can I partner with you, regardless of what we believe or if it's opposite? What we can believe in is that every person is afforded life. And as Elder Robert said, life more abundantly. And that is what our job is supposed to be. So collaborate is so going to be so essential for those churches who do not have the resources or the monetary in order to promote this.
George, can I add 2 sentences real quick?
Yes.
So another option as well, in addition to all of this, is create a nonprofit within your faith institution. I know some faith institutions, they have a nonprofit that's connected. That's our situation with the community church and Empowerment Enterprise too. So some of the stuff that the church cannot do in and of itself, it can be done through the nonprofit it can be to undergird the work that the church desires to do.
So there was one question that I overlooked, and it's, how can we keep the conversation going? How can we have faith-based led harm reduction clinics? Most of the people do not trust the centers. And I would start out by just saying, you've got to be out in the community and build a relationship. And those relationships are so key, including connecting with key community leaders. And because if you don't have buy-in from them, then you're not going to be successful.
And I will agree as well. I don't want us to overlook that those that are part of the harm reduction community are not leaders within that community. That is so crucial. It's almost they're the gatekeepers. I remember before I left Dallas, my last role in public health, I ran a research grant, and it was a research grant under the National Behavior Surveillance, and it was for substance use. And the best way for me to get into that community was to be in their environment, but find the gatekeeper because they trust them. And to be honest, let me contextualize the church, or from my Christian standpoint, they became the disciples. And they usher and welcome me into their community. And then they trusted me because I didn't show up judging them. I had resources for them, and they were willing to give their story, their testimony, in order so other people won't have to be impacted like they are. And it just made for a great relationship and a newfound way of working with marginalized communities. And so, yes, it is important that we go meet them where they're at, but rely on them. You know, we have this misconception because they're part of the harm reduction community that the drugs have taken their mind now. No, they're just as smart as we are. You know, they can help us minister to us as we turn around and minister the love that we want them to know that they certainly still have.
Elder Faison, 1 minute, closing thought.
Closing thought is that I appreciate the work that we get the opportunity to do. We get to do this harm reduction work as faith institutions. And the most impactful thing to me, change lives. I may not see the full transition. I may not see the full change as the one providing the service or as the one receiving the service. But knowing that lives have been changed speaks to my faith, speaks to the work that I do. So that's why I do the work, along with EE2 and the Community Church of Washington, D.C., and so many others.
Reverend Paulette.
I mean, it's just going to be an echo of what folks have said. I mean, really, this opportunity, this gift to lean into relationship and to lean into the wisdom of people with lived and living experience. They have been ministering to their own folks and to us for a really, really long time now. And we are being gifted with an opportunity to grow those relationships.
Thank you. Elder, take it away.
Yeah, so I want to speak directly to my transgender population, and particularly our LGBTQ plus and everything that's under the alphabet soup. Do know that there are brave and safe spaces to have this continuing conversation and resources. And if I may add, that God is not surprised. You know, before we were even created, and you know, I know a lot of discrimination is upon us, whether our sexual orientation and gender identity, but walk in the purpose that God has given you. If you are using substance use as a coping mechanism, and there is an opportunity where you want to be able to do other things outside of that, you know, please know that you're able to do that. Your visibility is so important. You are seen. And you are heard, and you, more importantly, you are loved. And so with the Human Rights Campaign, and even with my role as the state director of Alabama, I can be a conduit and an advocate for you for those resources. But I know how impactful it is for us just so we can navigate society, because we're society, how they treat us. Do know that I see you. The panelists, they see you. We love you, but more importantly, God is not surprised because God loves you as well.
And that's an incredible way for us to end our conversation. And I just want to thank personally each one of our panelists. You were beyond belief amazing. So thank you. So I wanted to draw attention to our session tomorrow. Here's Uplifting Our Voices Through Faith. And it's going to be a wonderful panel discussion at 3 p.m. tomorrow during the Stigma conference. And we invite you to, if you're in DC, to please come out to that. And we want to save the date for our next Interfaith pre-conference, which will be September 11th, 2024 in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we hope to see you there as well. And here's a list of our contact information. These slides and some of the resources will be emailed to you afterwards. And thank you, and have an incredible day. And I forgot, Thank you to the Stigma Conference, Dr. Rana and Patty. Thank you for allowing us to have this space.